The term Hellenist Jews is generally associated with the historical events and the Maccabean revolt 2,200 years ago. Can this term be applied to the present time?
The term Hellenist comes, of course, from the Greek word Hellas, which is the Greek word for Greece. Hellenism, therefore, refers to an affinity for all things Greek. A person who associated himself, identified with Greek culture, Greek thought, and also Greek religion, because these things always went together in those times. Such a person was referred to as a Hellenist. In other words, a person who, although not Greek by birth, decided to adopt a foreign culture, a foreign set of ideas and way of living, in order to fit in with his Greek surroundings. When Alexander the Great and his armies conquered the Persian Empire over 2,300 years ago, Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, came under Greek rule and therefore Greek influence. And this influence was pervasive and profound. And the Greeks set in place a system which utilized leading members of the subjugated populace in order to run efficiently and profitably the workings of government, essentially tax collection, etc., for the conquering power. And there were no shortage of Jews in Eretz Yisrael who were willing to play that role. And one of the preconditions for playing such a role and becoming a serious player in this system, headed by the Greek occupying government and its military forces, one of the preconditions for this was to be a Greek or be like a Greek. And the Greeks actually did not have a problem with a person who was not born a Greek, as long as that person adopted the ways of the Greeks. They in fact saw their mission as a kind of missionizing work to educate, to bring culture and progress to these more simple, backward, or as they described them, using the Greek term, barbaric peoples. And therefore, at that time, there arose a new class of people in Eretz Yisrael under Greek occupation. An aristocratic, wealthy class of people, born Jews, but Hellenized Jews, people who adopted all things Greek, rejected all things Jewish, in order to be acceptable, in order to get ahead, and in some cases also because perhaps they viewed Greek thought, Greek culture as being superior to Jewish thought and Jewish culture. But certainly the economic and social incentives were the major driving forces behind this phenomenon. And all the major tax collectors, tax farmers, because taxes in those days did not work as these things work today, essentially wealthy people, by way of bribe, purchased the right to be what was called a tax farmer. That is to say, this person, this individual, had to commit himself to supplying a certain amount of money as taxes from a certain part of the country. How exactly he procured these funds was of no interest to the government apparatus, as long as he fulfilled his contract. He had to supply a certain amount of money at the end of the year as taxes from a certain region. If he was able, and they were always able, to extort from the Jewish farmers and merchants in that particular region, above and beyond that amount, whatever he was able to extort and take for himself was his to keep. So we had a situation of a Greek occupation government, at least an occupation government in the eyes of the Jews. In the eyes of the Greeks, of course, they were running what was their land and their part of their empire by right, and there were Jews willing to collaborate with them, Jews who needed to show themselves, prove themselves to be Hellenized Jews, who had at heart the interests of the Greek authorities and not the Jewish populace. And in this way, Jewish society in Eretz Yisrael, the Jewish people were split into two distinct groups. The majority of the Jews who were loyal to their Jewish identity and to the Torah were oppressed and subjugated by ostensibly their Jewish brethren, who for the most part no longer considered themselves to be Jews, but rather to be Greeks. They were oppressed and subjugated by other Jews, Hellenized Jews, and of course by the government apparatus and system set in place by the conquering Greeks. And this split within Jewish society became more and more pronounced. And as we read at the beginning of the first book of the Maccabees, an accurate historical record of the events of that time, it was in fact these Hellenized Jews who approached the Greek authorities, the king and his advisors, and the local governor, and suggested that the Greek empire that ruled over Eretz Yisrael introduce deliberate and express policies of religious persecution to stamp out Torah Judaism, to eradicate Jewish nationalism and Jewish identity, in order to replace all of these things with a general, vague Hellenist identity and social order. And it is very important to recall, when we speak of these historic events, that it was largely the Hellenized Jews who set these events in motion. So when we read Rambam's very succinct, very concise summation of that reality in which the Jews found themselves, we must remember that it was a reality that was created first and foremost by some of the Jewish people themselves, those who chose to turn their back on their Jewishness, on the Torah, and everything that these things stand for. Rambam writes at the beginning of the third perek of Ilchot Merila Hanukkah as follows: Bevayt Sheni, during the time of the Second Temple, Keshem Malachu Yavan, during the time of the Greek Empire, at the height of its reign, Gazaru Gezeroth al Yisrael, they, the Greek authorities, made decrees and introduced policies of persecution, religious persecution against the Jewish people, uvitlu datham, and outlawed their religion, as we know from many sources, both our own internal Jewish sources and from external non-Jewish sources, things such as circumcision and the recording of the sighting of the moon in order to announce the beginning of the Jewish month, and other essential facets of Jewish life were banned and outlawed. And they outlawed the study of Torah and the performance of the mitzvot. And they did as they pleased with regards to the belongings, the property of the Jews who refused to go along with these policies, and their daughters. They would act as they pleased with regards to the women folk. They would kidnap and take daughters away from families, etc. And they also entered the temple, something which they had not done previously, despite the fact that they, the Greeks, had been ruling in Eretz Yisrael for many, many years. But they had never dared to enter the temple. Ufarasu bo parasoth, and they destroyed part of the complex. And the Jewish people were in terrible, dire straits. V'sar lehem liYisrael ma'od mipanehem. So Rambam describes the historical events. What Rambam does not mention in these very few words that he wrote here is that which we emphasized a moment ago. In other words, that it was the initiative, as recorded in the first book of the Maccabees, it was the initiative of that Hellenized class of Jews in the country who proposed and initiated these policies. And it would have been impossible for the Greeks to achieve any of their aims in this regard without the collaboration and support and encouragement of those Hellenized Jews. In other words, the widespread perception that the true story of Hanukkah, the historical reality of that time, was a struggle between the Jews and the Greeks, is not at all precise. In fact, it is misleading. To a great extent, the true struggle was within the Jewish people. It was a kind of civil war between the majority of the Jews in Eretz Yisrael, who were loyal to the Torah, who wished to be Jews, who did not want to emulate the Goyim, who were not Hellenized in any way, and a certain minority who were very powerful, wealthy, politically well-connected, a kind of aristocracy, essentially, who collaborated with the Greco-Syrian authorities, and they were the true instigators of the Hellenization policies introduced against the Jewish people. And these facts are clearly alluded to in the addition that we add to the Tefilloth and Birkat HaMazon during Hanukkah Al Hanisim, where we find the following statements. It speaks about Hashem coming to the assistance of our forefathers who rose up against their oppressors, and it speaks about these, initially certainly the Jews who rose up, the Maccabim and their followers were few in number. It speaks about Giborim being overcome by halashim, by the weak, giburim, heroes or battle-hardened experts in battle, in fighting, overcome by halashim, by the weak. Rabim biad ma'atim, the many were handed over to the few. Tame'im biad tuhurim, the impure into the hands of the pure. Rasha'im biyad sadikim, evil people into the hands of the righteous. Zedim biyad osakei toratecha. Now this term zedim we need to explain. People refer to as zedim, or in Rav Saadia Gaon's version, mizidim, handed over or overcome by osakei toratecha, literally those who study your Torah. And this term perhaps is not clear to all those who recite this tefillah al nisim so many times during the year. Rav Hirsch in his Perush, in his commentary on the Siddur, writes here as follows. He refers to these terms of Tame'im, Rosha'im, and Zedim, and he writes as follows: Hakawana layudim poreke ol, or hadeh hayawanim. These terms refer to those Jews who turned their back on the Torah, who rejected the yoke of heaven, or hadeh hayawanim, the supporters of the Yawanim, that is to say the Hellenized Jews that we spoke of. In other words, those who preferred Greek culture with all its ephemeral beauty and allure over the essential truths of the Torah. So writes Rav Hirsch here. And Rav Hirsch is very correct in pointing out that these terms many of these terms refer not to the Greeks or the Greco-Syrians, or the soldiers of the Greco-Syrian authorities, but to the actual Hellenized Jews. In other words, that part of the Jewish people who had become traitors to their own people, who had turned their backs on the Torah. Specifically, the term Zedim refers to such people, more specifically than the other terms. In Rav Saadia Gaon's version, as I mentioned, the term is Mezidim. And in Rambam's text of the Al Nisim, in his Nusach, it says, Ufoshe'im biyad osei toratecha. This term osei toratecha is very close to the term we find in Rav Saadia Gaon, osei Torah, those who live according to the Torah, those who hold up the Torah and hold it paramount, and those who act upon its instructions and its commandments, osei Torah, and poshe'im instead of zedim, writes Rambam. In other words, the criminal evildoers, because this is how authentic Torah Judaism relates to such people, the Hellenized Jews, who turn their backs on the Torah, on their people, on their heritage, and therefore on Hashem, and opted instead for the glitter and empty vanities of Greek culture. We see, therefore, that Hazal, who enacted this tefillah of Al Nisim, this addition to the tefillah that we recite, were not at all averse to laying the facts bare before us. They did not attempt to hide from us the plain and painful truth that a certain sector of the Jewish people, a minority, but a powerful, vocal, and vicious minority, who chose the culture and the ways of the foreign idol-worshipping Greeks over the ways of their forefathers, those Jews who rejected the Torah for Hellenic culture, are referred to by Hazal as Zedim and Poshe'im, criminal evildoers, and those who upheld the Torah and those who fought for the Torah are referred to as Osakei Toratecha, or Osei Torah, those who do and act according to the Torah. And this was the majority of the Jewish people. But there was a clear division a tremendous rift within the Jewish people. And now, fast forwarding to the present day, it would be a mistake, a serious mistake, to believe or to pretend that that historical reality belongs entirely to the past and is irrelevant to the present, because this is not so. Today, there are amongst the Jewish people a new breed of Hellenized Jews. That is to say, Jews who have entirely rejected their heritage, people who want to have nothing to do with the Torah, Jews who are only Jews in name, biological Jews, and halachic Jews also in most cases, but in every other way, in terms of their thinking, their ideology, their motives, their true aspirations, they are almost precise carbon copies of the Mithionim, the Hellenized Jews of that time of the Maccabim. It is true that there are today many non-Jews around the world who would like to see the Jewish people entirely uprooted from their unique heritage. And there are many Jews and governments and NGOs who spend quite literally billions of dollars to achieve this end. Organizations and individuals who donate money, allocate funds, support all manner of NGOs here in Israel and overseas in order to whittle away at the Jewish nature and character of the Jewish state, Israel. But much more dangerous than these people are the enemy within, the Hellenists of the present day. These people are to be found, without exception, in the Israeli left and in the international left. These people identify with Western culture, or what remains of it. These people are entirely opposed to anything at all that even has a whiff of Jewishness about it. And these people are very active and very real. And only a fool would deny this fact. One example of this phenomenon is the New Israel Fund. And they do not hide their intentions at all. The name says it all, the New Israel Fund. It is a fund which has at its disposal quite literally billions of dollars, some from Hellenized Jews and much of it from other non-Jewish sources. And their desire, their plan, is to have a new Israel, that is to say, an increasingly non-Jewish or un-Jewish Israel, in order to guarantee that Israel not be in any way a true reflection of Jewish history, Jewish civilization, and is to say, in other words, an Israel that has nothing to do, or as little as possible to do, with the Torah. We are witnessing today a struggle of titans, an historical battle for the soul of the Jewish people and its state. And it is absolutely essential that we understand the nature of this struggle, and that we refer to these various groups using the correct terminology. Because words, as opposed to what many people believe, are not just words. Words, in fact, are everything. Because words define how we understand, how we view things, how we come to internalize and understand the various phenomena which present themselves to us. It is usually the case that observers, political commentators, sociologists, referring to the divisions within Israeli society today, speak about the left and the right. And this is entirely misleading and incorrect. First of all, the terms left and right, historically, referring to these concepts in a generic historical sense, are not at all related to or analogous to the camps to which we refer here in Israel. The correct labels for the left and the right in Israel are really the Jews and those who do not wish to be Jews. And the correct term for those people, even though it's perhaps unpleasant to admit to this fact or to use this term to refer to these people, the correct term for these people is the Israelis. The Israelis versus the Jews. Now I know that to many an ear, upon first hearing, this sounds almost incredible, almost perhaps, in the view of some, inane. What do you mean Israelis versus Jews? But that is exactly the precise and accurate way to describe these two camps that are struggling for the soul of this nation today. And you should not think for one moment that it is a terminology of my own invention. I am in fact quoting directly from the very words uttered by two of the leading lights of this faction of modern-day Hellenists, the Israelis. I refer to none other, first of all, than Shimon Peres. When Benjamin Netanyahu narrowly defeated Shimon Peres in the election which was then a direct election for the Prime Minister of Israel in Taushin Nun Waw, 1996 leminyanan. Shimon Peres's reaction, a direct quote, was "Hayehudim nitzahu et haYisraelim." The Jews overcame the Israelis. Those were the words uttered by Shimon Peres. All one has to do when it comes to such issues is to listen closely to what the enemy or the opposing faction says, and to simply internalize what they mean. Shimon Peres very correctly described the people who voted for Netanyahu as the Jews, not because all of the people who voted for him were Haredi, ultra-Orthodox, or religious Orthodox Jews, or even traditional Jews by one measure or another. The common denominator of all those who voted for Benjamin Netanyahu in that election, and essentially in every election from that time to the present day, The common unifying principle that can be attributed to these people who voted for Netanyahu was and is that they view themselves first as Jews and second as Israelis, by which I mean that they share a certain allegiance to Jewish identity, and therefore they are all either traditional, in religious terms, traditional or even very religious, but they share this basic identification, self-identification, self-image of being Jewish and wishing to be Jewish, wishing to remain so. As opposed to those supporters of Netanyahu, those who voted in that election for Shimon Peres and those who have voted in subsequent elections for people of his ilk, the unifying principle and theme and ideology of those voters is being Israeli. And what does that mean, in fact, to be Israeli? According to their own definition, to be Israeli means to be a citizen of the country referred to as Israel, and therefore one can be a Jewish Israeli or a non-Jewish Israeli. There are, of course, many non-Jews in Israel who are absolutely Israeli according to that definition, but most certainly not Jewish. And many of them are very plainly anti-Jewish, in fact anti-Semitic, and do not have in any way, shape or form the interests of the Jewish people at heart, and in fact would like to see Israel as the former president of the Israeli Supreme Court, Aharon Barak, famously stated, Medinat kol ezrahea. They would like to see Israel be a state of its citizens, not a nation state, not a country defined by any concept of nationhood which involves Jewish history and civilization, culture and religion, all of which are, of course, inextricably entwined, but rather some general, amorphous, postmodern, non-national, non-specific definition called Israeli. This is what Shimon Peres meant, and he was entirely correct. All one has to do is listen and understand exactly what he said. Hayudim nitzchu et haYisraelim. And it was a very narrow victory. A very narrow victory indeed, by a few tenths of a percentage. The Jews, he said, overcame the Israelis. And that is why that election was so very significant in many ways. And it is entirely necessary that we understand that many of the initiatives and policies of what is referred to as the Israeli left have little or nothing to do with questions of land for peace, little or nothing to do with achieving peace. We know exactly how much peace was achieved by the Oslo Accords or by Ariel Sharon's disastrous and criminal actions with regards to the destruction of Gush Katif and the irresponsible, criminally irresponsible withdrawal from Gaza. This is plain for all to see. It is necessary to understand that there is a much more profound and perverse motivation underlying all of these policies and actions. In the eyes of the modern Hellenists, Israel ridding itself of major central parts of the land of Israel, of the Jewish people's homeland, is entirely part of their policy of making Israel more Israeli and less Jewish. I have heard it said that Hagaon Rav Shach, Eliezer Menachem ben Shach, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, the Rosh Yeshiva of the Ponevezh Yeshiva in Bnei Brak, many years ago said that the left wishes to give away parts of Eretz Yisrael, a policy which he, by the way, was not opposed to in principle, but he did understand very perceptively that the left wishes to do so in order to make Israel less Jewish. But if one wants to hear these words or this notion from the mouth of one of the architects, perhaps the major architect of the Oslo process, then we have to listen again, simply listen to the words of Ron Pundak, Dr. Ron Pundak, who tellingly was educated, his advanced education was entirely overseas. He himself said about the Oslo process, which he dreamt up, which he designed, which he was very active in promoting for many years. Many years after the Oslo Accords and before he died, he said the following: Ani rotze shalom kedei shetiye Yisraeliyut. I want peace, so said Ron Pundak. This quote can be found widely quoted on the internet, in order that there be an Israeliness. These are his words, Yisraeliyut, Israeliness, an Israeli reality which he felt was lacking. He continues, Hashalom enenu matara bifnei atzma. Peace is not a goal in itself, in and of itself. Zehu emtza'i. It is rather a means, laha'avirat Yisrael, to cause Israel to move me'idan ehad le'idan aher, from one historical period to a new historical, different historical period. Le'idan shel ma she'ani mahshiv k'medina normalit, to a period where Israel will be what I consider, he says, a normal country. Ma she'ani mahshiv k'medina normalit, that which I consider to be a normal state. I will explain what he means by this in a moment. And he himself uses the term Israelizatia, to make Israel more Israeli. Israelizatia shel ha'hevra b'makom Yehud shela, to make Israel more Israeli rather than more Jewish. Those are the words of Ron Pundak, the architect of the Oslo Accords. It is also relevant here to mention that which was said by another famous, iconic Israeli Hellenist, one of the leading lights of the Israeli left in the past, Yossi Sarid, who said immediately after the signing of the Oslo Accords, Nagoz halom Eretz Yisrael shlema. The dream of the Jewish people controlling all of Eretz Yisrael has been laid to rest. It can be forgotten about. And why was this important to him? Because he correctly understood that as long as the Jewish people, he, Yossi Sarid, and Ron Pundak, and Shimon Peres, and all of that Oslo group, the Oslo underground, who, against the explicit stipulations of Israeli law, began discussions with the PLO in order to bring about the Oslo Accords, and all those who supported these actions, these people all understand something which many unfortunately do not. Namely, that as long as the Jewish people have a connection to and control the Jewish Heartland, that is to say Hebron and Yerushalayim, the real heart of Yerushalayim, of Jerusalem, that is to say the old city, Har HaBayit, the Temple Mount, Shechem, Beth El, Bethlehem, etc., etc., all those places that we read about in the Tanakh, in the Bible, all the essential geographical locations, all those names that mean so much to Jewish heritage, Jewish history. They understood that as long as the Jewish people are somehow involved with those parts of the country, the Jewish people will in some way remain Jewish. Perhaps not religious necessarily always, but they will not be able to escape their Jewish identity. The coastal plain, living on the narrow strip, the beachfront of Eretz Yisrael, on the Mediterranean, where the Pelishtim, the Philistines, and other foreign nations in ancient history, where they resided, and not in the Israeli heartland, that somehow is a place which means less to the average Jew, to the Jewish psyche. But if you speak about the heartland of Eretz Yisrael, if the Jewish people are attached to that part of the country, they will never be able to escape the reality of who they are, their history, their culture, and therefore their religion. And therefore this will be a tremendous impediment, an obstacle in achieving the true goal of these modern-day Hellenists, and that is to Hellenize, Westernize, de-Jewify the Jewish people and turn them simply into Israelis, people who live in a certain area, people who are citizens of the world, culturally speaking, people who do not have any deep, profound connection to anything Jewish. The real dichotomy, the true division in Israel today is not left and right. These are essentially meaningless terms. The truth is that many people who today are associated with the left know, and some of them openly admit, that there is no possibility of achieving peace with the Arabs. They may have believed it at one point, foolishly, but they know today that this is not the case. Only the truly moronic could believe in such a thing today. But they do know that it is essential to create an Israel which is as non-Jewish as possible. It is necessary to truncate the land of Israel. It is necessary to distance the Jewish people from anything that could possibly remind them of who they are, who they once were, and why we are here. This is the true division within the Jewish society, within the Jewish nation today, between those who wish to see themselves and their children and their descendants as Jews, and those who wish to simply assimilate into what they perceive as Hellenized Jews in ancient times perceived Hellenic culture to be the true expression of progress and human advancement. They wish to see Jews today join the great march of postmodernist, directionless and morally bankrupt Western society. Only if we understand that which goes on in Israel today, the various forces struggling for power within Israel today, and all the forces outside Israel that feel themselves driven to be part of this struggle, Jews and non-Jews. Only if we view things in these terms will we understand what is going on today. Only if we internalize these truths will we understand that history does repeat itself, just as there once was this internal division and struggle within the Jewish people for ascendancy between the Hellenized Jews and the authentic Jews, so it is today. It is also essential that we understand that what defines a person in terms of these two camps within the Jewish people and within the various organizations and governments and individuals who have joined this battle, what defines where a person stands is not always religious observance in the technical sense. Because you see, over 2,000 years ago, a Hellenized Jew did not observe the mitzvot of the Torah, did not live any kind of Jewish lifestyle. This was one of the clear indications in ancient times that a Jew belonged to the other camp. For example, if a Jew did not observe Shabbat, if he was Mahalel Shabbat b'fer Hesyah, if he openly, publicly flaunted the sanctity of the Shabbat, of the Sabbath day, it was clear that such a person had entirely broken ranks with the Jewish people. Today, things are much less clear, and therefore there is much room for confusion. Today there are, unfortunately, not a few Jews, and it must be said, not a few rabbis, who are essentially Hellenized in terms of their thinking, in terms of their moral compass, their ideological orientation, their value system. And yet, despite that fact, they are observant in many ways, technically speaking. They observe the Shabbat in many cases, kashrut, many other obvious areas of Jewish life. Of course, no one knows precisely what another individual does in his home, behind closed doors, but from what we are able to see and therefore judge, we see many people who wear a kippah, for example, who associate themselves with various religious organizations or live in religious yishuvim, towns, neighborhoods in Israel. This is also true, possibly, overseas as well. There are certain Jews overseas who are technically speaking Orthodox. That is certainly how they present themselves, and ostensibly it is so. But in terms of their thinking, they are entirely assimilated. This point was made to me many years ago by a certain professor, a religious Zionist right-wing professor, who very perceptively said to me that there are many today, he said to me in Hebrew, Yesh harbe datiim meshumadim. There are many Jews who are known as datiim, but who are essentially meshumadim, that is to say, assimilated, Hellenized Jews. In other words, they wear a kippah, they live in a Jewish neighborhood, they go to the Beit Knesset, they go to shul, but essentially they have bought in to the left, or more precisely the Hellenized Jews' worldview. And many of them are not even fully aware of this fact, by the way. And there are also, I repeat, and it's unfortunate that one has to stress this, but it is a fact, there are many rabbis who fit this description as well. And what is even more galling is the fact that these rabbis, not infrequently, twist the Torah, twist the words of the Torah, misrepresent and distort the Torah. They make use of their knowledge, sometimes superficial and sometimes more serious. They utilize their knowledge of the Torah in order to prove, so to speak, their own ideological direction and preferences. And it's not difficult to do so. It is very easy to misrepresent many aspects of the Torah, to misquote, take things out of context, sometimes misunderstand, sometimes deliberately and sometimes inadvertently. It is possible for a person to study the Torah and completely misunderstand the thrust and the true meaning and direction of the Torah. If a person studies Torah whilst wearing the wrong spectacles, one can completely misunderstand, misread, and misrepresent that which the Torah is all about. And only time and many difficult trials and tribulations that are yet before us will make it clear to all, where all people, Jews and non-Jews, religious Jews and secular Jews, and ostensibly religious Jews, but in practice Hellenized Jews, only future events, those events that we've already witnessed in many cases, and the things that we live through today, and I believe future events, even more so, will make it sometimes tragically clear where people stand on these issues. And therefore, we must not allow ourselves to believe for one moment that Hanukkah is a story and a time that belongs to the past. Hanukkah was Bayamim Hahem, and it is also very much Bazaman Hazeh. It was a long time ago, and it is still very real at this moment in time.
The production of these videos and maintaining this channel demands much time and money. If you enjoyed this video, please show your appreciation and support. To make a donation, please go to www.machonshilo.org and press the PayPal button, which appears on the upper right-hand side of the home page. To sponsor a video or purchase Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael, please write us at office@machonshilo.org.